think we are live on Facebook now. I'm going to just double check and make sure. Yep. Cool. All right. So hello, Facebook. Hello, Neil. Hello, patrons. So this is the second live mutations sessions. The idea behind this is to basically create a space for conversation around topics of the evolution of consciousness, philosophy, metaphysics, and so on, and sort of just kind of bring my writing and editorial work into dialogue with everybody else in a fun way. Pathless Path. Yes. And hi, Facebook. Nice to see you guys. I have a little fun background going on this time. Doesn't really work out exactly the way I wanted, but that's just some fun YouTube video playing in the background, vaporware. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. So yeah, this is my mutations salon of sorts. This is for us to philosophize together, talk about everything, talk about what's happening in culture and consciousness. And I mentioned to my patrons during the last live stream that it would be good to have some guests on too and just sort of philosophize with some guest speakers. So if you know somebody, or if you'd like to recommend somebody, definitely let me know. I'd be happy to hear you out. And especially my patrons, if you guys want to come on and just philosophize with me, that would be pretty fun. You're more than welcome to. But I have a list on there on Patreon of particular individuals who I'd like to have on. So definitely cast your vote. And who knows, maybe this could sort of morph into, I was thinking since the last time, after chatting with a few patrons, that this could kind of turn into a podcast of sorts, because Patreon offers some hosting services and RSS services where you can just upload, at the very least, audio. So this could become kind of the main focus, and that would be pretty neat. And it would be a good excuse for me to record, that's my cat, record conversations with everybody who I'm conversing with for my book and my books. So yeah. And I figure since last time we did this, Ursula K. LeGuin has passed away. Very unfortunately. LeGuin is one of my favorite science fiction writers and authors, just writers in general of anybody I've ever read. So I figured I could just kind of just start with that and then move on to some of the topics I listed there. Who here is familiar with Le Guin's work or has a particular text that really resonated with them? Love to hear from you, especially on Facebook, guys. For me, it's The Dispossessed. And I did a book club for The Dispossessed about, a year and a half ago now, with Marco Morelli and Lit Geeks, which has since become Metasci. And yeah, so what to say about that? Let me just turn off the light here. The lighting is getting kind of weird. What to say about Le Guin and her passing? Well, first of all, I've always appreciated her Taoist approach, if you could call it that. She was very self-prescribed, very interested in Taoism. And a lot of her books, especially in the Heinisch cycle, I admit I haven't read the Earthsea trilogy, tend to be exploring very interesting philosophical and metaphysical concepts. And also, especially with The Dispossessed, but also with The Left Hand of Darkness, there's a very interesting emphasis on politics and how to create utopias, or what a vastly different kind of society based on vastly different principles and ideas would run and come to life. And in a kind of Philip K. Dickian way, it's building a world and seeing what happens in that world and how that world kind of thrives and survives and has its own sets of problems. And in doing that, you reflect upon the possibilities of our world. And so I think her novels have been these beautiful utopian anarchist explorations of the possible, especially The Dispossessed. And I would bring up The Dispossessed probably because out of all of Le Guin's novels, this one dovetails in very nicely and very powerfully with integral consciousness. And And at the same time too, this came out in 1974, and that was also the time that the human potential movement was going on, and we have all these different schools of thought happening, and there's Lindisfarne and Esalen and all of these kind of countercultural movements that are exploring. Don't mind my cat if you can hear her. She's very vocal. She likes to let me know when she wakes up for a nap. But you have all of these different countercultural movements that are on the one hand, non-fictional utopia experiments, and then we have fictional utopian experiments going on. Jeffrey Kripal talks a lot about that too in Esalen and in Mutants and Mystics, where he's kind of exploring, the creation of ions in Esalen, especially Esalen, and then the cultural imagination of X-Men and the concept of mutation, appropriately for this show or podcast or whatever you want to call this. Happening synchronously, so that fictional attempts at imagining or sensing or intuiting a new possible world are coinciding with non-fictional historical events that are kind of synced up. So I kind of see LeGuin as one of these very fascinating writers who was tapping into something. And what's interesting about the Heinisch cycle of the Dispossessed and all of her science fiction work that's in this universe is, despite the particular problems on the worlds which wrestle with issues like imperialism and capitalism and so on, as a whole, the universe is this sort of sprawling diaspora of human beings who land on these planets and, because of the time relativity, become so different from one another, yet at the same time continue to communicate with each other through, I think, the Ansible, which creates a simultaneous connection between worlds that transcends time and space. And at the same time, they're very decentralized. The Heinisch communities, I think it used to be an empire, and now it's a sort of deflated, but still very vibrant, decentralized and networked cosmic civilization. So again, it's just a very interesting way of imagining a utopian civilization that isn't perfect, but is nevertheless decentralized and networked and all those interesting things. But in particular, just to kind of end this riff on the Dispossessed, it explores two worlds. One is what you would imagine to be our planet, very much like us. There's different city-states. They're all wrestling with each other. They are more centralized. They work with the nation state and so on. Hold on, let me just pet my cat. She really wants me to pet her. Yes, I know. I'm having a live stream. Yeah. Okay. Live stream problems. Cats and the internet, right? Okay. So, sorry, I got a question from folks on Facebook. Was your old YouTube channel The Pathless Path? Yep, that's it. Johan, don't know you from back then. I used to do YouTube vlogs. I don't remember. We may have interacted before on there a long time ago. So, hello. That was like 10 years ago, back before YouTube was what it is today. And we had like a little network of video essay philosopher friends who would all create video posts and make responses and everything. So it was a different time, and it was really kind of a gem, a kind of a cultural experimental space that I still really value those times. But yeah, thanks for popping in here. And again, guys, on Facebook, I'm reading the comments. So like, if you want to just chime in, this is what this is about. But so yeah, I'm talking about the Dispossessed, and Shevek, the character, is coming up with this technology to travel faster than the speed of light, or to some degree, it's transcending the time relativity. And the whole theme of the book is about transcending time and transcending the boundaries of space. So, there's these two worlds. One is an anarchist utopian experiment on the moon, and then there's this world that's a lot like Earth. And the two worlds kind of are at odds with each other throughout the novel. But Shevek is this guy from the anarchist planet who comes up with this kind of revolution in science, a kind of breakthrough in consciousness and mutation, which is all about this breaking down of boundaries and walls. And he goes to the other world to share the technology with them in this kind of mutual coming together. And so, yeah, I really recommend it, though, as a kind of an integral oriented book in terms of a Gebserian integral, because what Gebser talked about very often was that the integral consciousness, as we understand it as a phenomenological orientation, is one that breaks through time and space, that creates time freedom and space freedom. The spatialized mental consciousness is breaking down and transcending through this kind of leap into time freedom and space freedom. So again, here we are with this novel in the 70s, shortly after Gebser's death, kind of exploring these things as this sort of radical breakthrough, a need for this mutation in the consciousness of these two civilizations as they wrestle with these larger complex issues. But anyway, I recommend it, and I can't recommend Ursula K. Le Guin's writings in general enough to you if you haven't checked them out. And I will be, this will be part of passages from tomorrow in the sense that I'll be looking at some of Le Guin's work in a little bit more detail, bringing in some Deleuze and some other philosophers to kind of analyze her work. So yeah. So let me just check Facebook again. Hello, Jordan. Hi, Mark Schmanko. I see you're here. And David, nice to see you. Joseph from the Philip K. Dick class. Very cool. Cool. Hi, everybody. So yeah, the other topics are, let's see, what are we going to riff on? Well, speaking of Deleuze, right? Deleuze and Delanda. So I've recently been sort of diving into, or back into, 1,000 Plateaus, and I've found it kind of interesting. For those of you who are familiar with William Irwin Thompson's version of the cultural ecologies and this idea that to really understand the evolution of consciousness, you have to kind of ground yourself in literally the embodied spaces in which civilizations arrive and thrive and interact with each other. So, they are very different. And he calls these cultural ecologies, and it has to do with the biosphere, climate, geography, artistic mediums, communication mediums. So it's bringing in sort of media studies and climatology and geology, and it needs all of those things to kind of get the umwelt of a particular existence of a nation state or a civilization, or et cetera. But it really made me start to think about what Deleuze is talking about in this kind of new materialism. And I'm not necessarily a materialist, but a materialism, and I'm appreciating this about Deleuze and even Delanda in their work with this, because they're very much like this as well. And Delanda wrote an interesting book that, for those of you who want to kind of really kind of dive deep into this kind of thinking, it's a challenging book. I won't pretend that it's not. But yeah, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. It kind of works with geography and the flows of energy, and seeing, for instance, seeing a city not just as, a separation from nature, but as something that's always involved and implicitly involved in nature through flows of energy, through the acquisition of solar power that creates the food, that through the agrarian society, the flow of mineralogy that flows through the city and sort of is its lifeblood, and these trade routes and these trade systems and the use of resources. And it kind of creates, focusing so much on this kind of material flowing through time shifts, I think, our attitude out of a kind of, okay, here's civilization, what are they about, what are their value systems, and embeds that into kind of a living biospheric planetary form of thinking that involves everything, and is a very kind of messy, organic, and nonlinear kind of style or approach to thinking about the rise and fall of civilizations and city-states and so on. And you could still go into some of the more kind of sublimated aspects. You don't have to focus merely on like the geography and flows of energy. It's just a good way to reorient yourself to thinking about these things in a way that's not too abstracted from their realities. It's kind of reattuned to the natural systems and flows of things. And then you can go into, you know, media studies and so on, you know, with a little bit more of a kind of nonlinear postmodern approach. So I'm kind of just sort of painting an approach to the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of what Thompson calls cultural ecologies, in a way that's a little bit more organic and a little bit more friendly to postmodern thinking. And in a way that kind of opens up postmodern thinking, arguably, to talk about emergence, to talk about planetization and what Teilhard described as the new sphere and so on. There's a connection here that is really kind of undermined or undervalued for understandable reasons. I think, you know, focusing on developmental charts and maps and so on is helpful. But I think this approach you might find to be a little bit more friendly and a little bit less inflammatory when it comes to kind of getting postmodern thought. And I bring this up because there's an interesting connection, I think, in the integral world with some certain romantic movements that are happening today with like Jordan Peterson and so on, with this kind of pull back from postmodern philosophy, this retreat from that, with some right criticisms for sure, but really, you know, I think the way out is through, and we have to kind of assess what postmodern thinking is doing and kind of bring it up into higher levels of sort of meta patterning, or what Richard Doyle calls metacognition, right? Is where you're seeing a kind of imaginative space where all the different parts are playing together and are still nevertheless creating a sense of meaning through this sort of thing, but a more participatory meeting, of course, right? I hope any of this is making sense, but that's sort of like my thinking coming in today, just sort of talking about that Deleuze, Delanda, and history as these sort of geographical flows of energy is like a starting space to start to think about planetization. And Teilhard did this too in his own way. If you read The Phenomenon of Man or The Activation of Energy, especially that one, he's really trying to kind of get, I mean, he was interested in geology, first of all, as a young student. So he was really trying to get a sense of the earth and the flows of the energy of the earth, and sort of seeing things that way, to paint a picture of what planetization means, as sort of an intensification of all of these, you know, the combination of human systems and then planetary systems and so on. So, you know, I think I would credit Teilhard for being rather complex about that as well. But yeah, so does anybody want to riff on anything and bring anything else up? What's on your mind today? You know, what's happening with you in this crazy historical moment where everything seems to be happening all at once? So if you'd like, just like leave your questions in the chat on Facebook, and I will grab them there. Let me just refresh the page over there. If not, I can just keep riffing. Or if I've just scared everybody away because no one knows what I'm talking about. But yeah, so God, do I really want to open this up? What is everyone's thoughts on this whole debate with Peterson? It's just, it's unavoidable, even if you're trying to avoid it. I have gone down a rabbit hole on YouTube recently, and by doing that with Peterson, now he's just all over my YouTube recommended videos, and so that's just led me further down the rabbit hole. And then even in places where I was not looking for him to pop up, he's been in the conversation. So in some ways, I'm just, you know, I'm yielding to it. I've posted about it on Facebook, and you know, I'm happy to kind of riff on it with you guys as long as we're cordial with each other. Joseph's mentioning Doug Lane from Zero. I've watched that, one of his videos on YouTube. I don't know if it's the same one, but you're saying it's a podcast about the interview with Peterson. Oh, He'll be the first Marxist to have dialogue. Hell, that's awesome. So, that's the problem here. He's on a platform. He's kind of talking in the media. He's got his YouTube lectures everywhere where he's being interviewed about his position. And I don't see a lot of conversations with him in the left. And the ones that I do see are just kind of going, I don't want to work with this guy because he's not basing anything in any facts. And even if that is the case, I think even if you think he's not really grounded to any degree, and he's not really addressing his critiques, I think having him in a space with somebody who's willing to talk with him and willing to engage in an academic intellectual jiu-jitsu with him in the present moment is much more impactful than having a kind of back and forth where he's shouting from his podium and the left is shouting from their podium. I'd rather see these spaces where in my opinion, where he's dismantled in terms of his understanding of postmodernism and Marxism and so on. I think he takes a very extreme view, a very reactionary view. Even as you're mentioning, Zero Books brings up this point a lot, that the loss of meaning and the issues with late capitalism, what Mark Fisher describes as capitalist realism, this kind of inescape from the end of history, right? Like everything is becoming this sort of faded mall. We don't seem to be able to move time forward. And this is a very integral question, right, about time. How do we move forward with this? And for Peterson, I think he's kind of looking back and saying, let's romanticize, in my opinion. I'm not saying he's saying this explicitly, but I think he's romanticizing a period of Western humanist individualism. And he's saying we need to revive that and not lose that because meaning is there. He's looking back, and on the left, the more nuanced and complicated question is to how to imagine going forward, how to romanticize forward, in the kind of like William Irwin Thompson way. How do we imagine an insurrection? How do we imagine a revolution? And the kind of utopian projection into the future through, both science fiction and through the kind of the Charles Eisenstein calls the news story. I think these are more, for me anyway, these are more fruitful narratives to entertain and explore and experiment with than necessarily kind of retrieving something. So I think he's a romantic movement, and sociologically what we see with this kind of beyond everything he's saying about Marxism and postmodernism, right, is I think a lot of people are drawn to him because of his basic understanding and decent understanding of depth psychology and the hero's journey and that kind of thing. So I think as a sociological phenomenon, people are grabbing that, and he's having a kind of sociological moment that's telling us more about what people are looking for and needing to some degree, than necessarily that the points that he's making explicitly are correct. I'm just more interested in why he's arresting popular attention right now and drawing so many people in. And again, I've watched some of his videos about, cleaning your room and all that kind of stuff. And, to some degree it's good for, individual development and so on. That's fine. It's just like everything he says about Marxism and postmodernism is just it's so radically reactionary and kind of moralizing. I don't really know what to do with it. It's hard to pick it apart. So it'd be really cool, interesting to see an actual dialogue, a Marxist have conversations with him. I don't know if anything will come of it, but I just would be interested in that. As many of us here probably are too, right? We're kind of hooked into this cultural explosion happening and just can't look away. So yeah, what is everyone else's thoughts on all that? I mean, what do you think of this whole idea of Jason Louv? I don't know if he's watching. I saw him pop up earlier. He had a good post about Peterson, just kind of saying that, this idea of retreating into the individual and sort of fixing your own life up before thinking about any of the way that we're constructing social activism, which is more of a collectivist orientation or whatever, is more important. And, I don't know. Like, obviously I agree with Jason that if that's all they're doing, and that is all they're doing, it's too partial, you know, it's too incomplete as a project of civilization. I don't think we can retreat into cleaning our rooms and working toward the sort of Jungian state of wholeness alone. I think it goes part and parcel with helping society, and the individual is obviously constructed by their society. So there's a dynamic here that is inextricable. And if you're thinking more in the kind of cultural ecology, right? If you're thinking about human societies as living cultural ecologies that are embedded in planetary ecosystems, social ecosystems, etc., the idea of the individual is only an instance, a kind of rhizomatic nub in this larger interbeing that's just as important. So, I mean, you know, if you emphasize one, the other gets neglected. And so I think we need a kind of continuum here, a much more sophisticated understanding of what it means to work towards a kind of Jungian sense of individuation at the same time as, you know, having a part to play in making this world better, and empathizing with that, and being, you know, having enough wholeness and integrity to kind of, you know, understand, you know, you've got that. So, okay, now help other people, you know, like be a decent person. Being a decent person is like not feeling, I don't know, you're on the defensive about your patriarchy being taken away. I know I'm simplifying it, but anyway, that's my kind of rant on that. But I'm happy to hear everybody else's, or to riff on something else, something completely unrelated to Peterson. And believe me, I'm happy to do that. I'm just kind of in the muck and the mire of it all. So, anyways, so the only other topic maybe we can kind of go into here. I don't know, what time are we at? 1:30. So we'll probably go another half an hour. Love to open it up to questions, like I've been saying. If you have any thoughts or insights about today's political climate, this is the place to share it. But I think, you know, again, from this perspective of what the hell is consciousness doing? What is going on in the sort of breakdown and breakthrough right now with, you know, this kind of neoconservatism, you know, the kind of reassessment of the left, and the left and the right altogether. I mean, how can we move forward with this kind of fragmentation of politics and tribalization of everybody moving to their little camp, right? So how do we get past that? Because I think, you know, Gebser talks about this a lot too, in terms of, you know, this is actually probably a good point to bring up, just as sort of a note for framing Gebser in the current conversation. This kind of poo-pooing of Western post-war thought as a sort of nihilist, postmodern, you know, meaning is arbitrary kind of thing. There are many different reactions to the war and to modernity. And Gebser actually, you really have to frame him. I mean, if you were to take Gebser and say, okay, I'm going to go to an academic setting and read about Gebser, how would I understand him? How would we situate him? He's a post-war thinker in many respects, and in this respect, he is seeing the breakdown of civilization. He's very sensitive to it. He's lived through it. I mean, he was almost shot at the border. His friend Lorca, who is a famous poet some of you probably are familiar with, was killed at the border, Spanish border, and he barely escaped with his life. His apartment was blown up in Spain, I think just a few, or was it France, just a few hours before leaving. So he lived through, you know, he was born, grew up during World War I, and lived through World War II as an adult. So ever-present origin, and his work is about this kind of this idea of the transformation of consciousness and a breakdown of a mentality. And it's a response. And I think perhaps as good as some of the other responses in the post-war, or better, because it's kind of saying there is a kind of spiritual there is a spirit behind this mutation and this kind of new leap, right? That we have to pay attention to, and that we shouldn't just be, bereft of meaning and so on, but that Gebser's not talking about meaning in terms of archetypes and depth psychology. He's talking about these kind of phenomenological and spiritual origins of consciousness, and that was at work even in this kind of catastrophe of history. So just as a kind of way to not become nihilistic or pessimistic or cynical, right? All too, as Gebser says, all too symptomatic of humanity in transition, to paraphrase him. Yeah, so he's an interesting post-war thinker that has a very different spiritual approach to addressing the breakdown of Western civilization. And we're still living with it today. And a lot of his critiques, I think I mentioned a few last time, just about what the deficient, as what he called a deficient structure, mental rational structure, which is emphasizing it for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the mentality of modernity, of materialism and sort of Western science and so on since like the 1600s and sort of the Renaissance period, is this movement away from kind of the spiritual world and the sort of interior landscape, the psychic and imaginal world, and into this kind of material space that emphasizes space and material space and the event horizon of history as a kind of material plane. The breakdown of that, the kind of end game of that is this sort of, he says this in, he writes this in 1948, the hyperfragmentation. Everybody's got a little territory that they're defending. And as emancipatory as these are, they're infighting. And he's using analogies of the Protestant Reformation and this hyperfragmentation of all of these different groups, all kind of battling each other. I think a lot of the times we can resonate with that happening today. So I think, Gebser was saying, he wasn't being a romantic, and he wasn't saying, let's not do that, let's go back to some other period that was better. But I think he is saying, as important as emancipatory movements are, it's also important we have solidarity and, a deeper kind of connection to the human spirit, So anyway, that's sort of just my riff on that, and Gebser in our postmodern hyper-fragmented reality where everybody's fighting everybody else. Joseph, I don't know Nick Land. If you could let me know about him. I'm not sure what he's wrote, but I'd be very curious to know, especially if it's about what I've been rambling about today. So yeah, that's just my own take on Gebser and the current postmodern internet breakdown going on right now. And again, what is everyone else? What are you all thinking? What are your thoughts on this? Or if you'd like to take it in a different direction, I'm happy to do that. This is all about everybody participating here in these conversations. And also to some degree, I'm just looking at my notes here. We have to really kind of think about what, we're talking about consciousness and evolution. I think a good way to ground ourselves is to kind of ask the thing that we're really into, how is that speaking and diagnosing the present? And I think, that's where a lot of us get started with Integral or the New Story or a lot of the countercultural mentalities, because they're looking for a way to kind of get what's going on. Okay, there's an illness, we can diagnose it, we can feel it and sense it, and this explanation feels right, and then we kind of get swept up in the rest. Well, here's the explanation for it, and now here's a kind of answer, a kind of vision, a kind of reaching into the future. So that's what I'm always looking for and I have to review it again and again. For me, for instance, in terms of, Land, Nick Land, just to interrupt for a moment, Joseph saying Land was one of the early accelerationists. Now he's basically an alt-writer doing speed in Shanghai. I associate him with Peterson as a similar figure. though more Phil Dickian, perhaps. That's interesting. I should probably check out his earlier works. I don't know about his alt-rightness. That's I don't know. But yeah, thanks for that. I'll definitely just gonna write a note about checking out. And accelerationism is sort of an interesting topic as well. But I've, at a completely superficial valuing of accelerationism, that I always bring it back to Gebser, but Gebser talks in terms of the integral structure and the breakdown of the mental rational structure. As I was mentioning, there is an acceleration. There's a speeding up of time and motoricity, and this inability of to catch up with time seeming to run away from us. And I've always understood that as having something to do with accelerationism, this kind of phenomenon. But the phenomenon itself, in a negative sense, is the manifestation of the integral, the achronon, right? The time freedom. And it's a kind of attempt to kind of wrap ourselves around time and to comprehend and grasp time through this sort of dying mental structure. But it doesn't work. And in some way, I think these kind of transitional states where a structure of consciousness is collapsing and in on itself and imploding, and this new structure is trying to erupt and mutate, is just as important as, more important sometimes than seeing them as distinct leaps. Here's the magical, then here's the mythical, because this in-between space is actually what seems to kind of help that leap take place. The acceleration of technology and capitalism and so on, sort of the runaway force of technology, to some degree, is a sort of rapid gestation of the kind of planetary exoskeleton, right? So in some ways, it's almost like it requires or it needs the breakdown to happen as sort of integral to the breakthrough. And I know that sounds sort of like, inanely obvious, but you really think about it, and you think about the kind of deficient issues that are happening today, and they're kind of needed. We kind of need those things as sort of the push off. So I find that to be kind of interesting. But, Wimmer and Thompson has a similar thing when he's talking about the evolution of history and history of consciousness, and that evil enunciates the next world order. And he's really saying the same thing, like something catastrophic and seemingly problematic and dark and even evil and nefarious can be a kind of early harbinger of a new mentality that we just don't get yet. That's a sort of early symptom of, like so on. And I think accelerationism and the speed up and the runaway technology are not themselves, as the techno-utopians would probably say, the answer to our problems, but are kind of a hint of things to come, which are something much more mystical or spiritual or sublimated. But they're kind of a material form of that's kind of problematic and kind of causing haywire, right? So that's sort of my understanding of accelerationism, just to kind of riff on that. And I completely forgot where I was going before that about Gebser and the structures and history and so on. But I think I kind of said what I wanted to say about that. Samantha's saying, just reread Watts' The Wisdom of Insecurity. It's a great book. Thinking more about our relationship with and to time. Yeah, so I don't know, Samantha, if you've read Gebser, but difficult book. But what Gebser is using to understand how consciousness evolves through time is a series of phenomenological orientations to time and space. So is time cyclical? Is it rhythmic? There's different forms and experiences of time, even in our day-to-day life, let alone in the vast history. And this is even using time, right? The concept of big history. In the vast stretches of human evolution and human history, the way we've experienced the world in terms of time and space has radically changed. And you can kind of take evidence of that from works of art and cultural artifacts, and really kind of trying to engage with the phenomenology of what our ancestors have left behind for us. And we can only do that so much, and we can only participate in that so much to the degree that we're maybe projecting our own mentality into theirs. But so that's sort of what Gebser is exploring. But yeah, time is interesting. And I think a lot of, what Alan Watts is playfully exploring is this sort of leap into the present, and his awareness, the construction of linear time and narratives and the sort of self-identity through time, whereas the present, as Gebser also mentions, has in his view, and this is the interesting thing why I always come back to the time freedom and achronon to describe the integral as a very important understanding. The present is not just the now. The present has within it all things latent. The future and the past are alive in us in the present. And so attuning ourselves to the present is it's an intensification of our own consciousness and understanding and apprehension of who and what we are. Any contemplative would talk about that. And Alan Watts talks about that in terms of, the sort of mystical realizations, but as a kind of integral thinker, philosopher, writer, this is sort of where you're always kind of coming back to, is sort of what is latent in the present, what is going on in consciousness transformation. And again, that's sort of the point of the book passages, and also, just my approach to integral writing and integral scholarship. And again, on this track of Marxism and capitalism and all that stuff that we're talking about with Peterson, I recently came across an old talk by Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, talking about, I think it's called something from the future. I have it written down here. I should probably just mention it. Signs from the Future, and this is from like 5 years ago. And he's talking about political movements that are going on right now. There's a lot of unrest right now, right? Occupy and the Arab Spring and so on, the sort of anti-globalization solidarity movements happening that kind of erupted in post-2012, interestingly enough. 2011, 2012, right on that cusp. And where, he kind of frames them as, it kind of struck me, and I took a note of it, that he frames these revolutionary impulses, something that's very political, as signs from the future. And he brings up Deleuze talking about Proust's Madeline, and I should just bring it up here, saying basically, we have to develop, okay, so I'm just going to quote it for you here. Oh, I don't have it written down here. Oh, well. But his point was quoting Deleuze, talking about Proust and the Madeline. So let me pet my cat again, everybody. All right. Come sit here with me, All right. Okay. Sorry, folks. She's a darling. She's just, she needs a little affirmation. Don't we all? So yeah, talking about Zizek and Madeline, if you're not familiar with the Madeline story, Proust is eating this like cookie with his tea, and then he like bites into it. And long story short, it's exploring sort of memory and selfhood through time. And he has this kind of profound moment of retrieving a childhood memory of the Madeline, and it comes to life in him, and it is this kind of an interesting exploration of time and the passage of time and the presence of the past. But for Zizek, he's saying, these revolutionary moments, and of course Zizek is this Marxist revolutionary, so he's a very political interpretation of this, but as an integral philosopher, you have to look at that as well. He's saying that these fragments of a utopian future, of this transformed world, erupt and displace themselves. And he's saying, Deleuze is saying something very similar. They are moments in our space, but out of our time. They're from the future. And so he sees these kind of revolutionary moments like Occupy and so on as sort of distorted, perverted eruptions of the latent future, fragments of that future as it attempts to kind of assert itself and realize itself in our present. And so I like the kind of relativity of time that Zizek was bringing in here. Again, this is the language of an integral thinker, I think, is to kind of play with a language of time and different structures of time. So So yeah, and I don't know where I'm going with this besides the point that even revolutions and what's going on today in the present is this kind of time play, this kind of attempt to sort of break through into a new time. And to the degree that we are continuing to implement the mentality of the present, the sort of deficient mental rational, as it's hyperfragmenting and focusing on space and materialism, and not on so much the relationship between space and what Thompson would call complex dynamics and the kind of chaos theory and human beings wrapped up in the larger ecologies of networks of relation. To the degree that we're not able to move into this kind of more space of interbeing is the degree that, we're not allowing that time to be born forth. And as I mentioned before, perhaps that's part of the struggle. Perhaps that's necessary for many, many failures to take place. In a kind of morphogenic learning, where this new structure is attempting to assert itself and working with its own failures to creatively wrestle with consciousness and bring itself into being in a way that would actually work. I'm kind of giving it its own agency. And I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, or if it's just us. But I would probably say that another kind of humbling aspect here is that with the structures, they need, they do kind of appear to have as if they have their own agency, insofar as the people who are compelled to say, I'm integral or so on, or not even that, just any of the past structures, when they happen, the individuals are very much compelled to bring something forth, like an artist or a scientist who's sort of just obsessed and needs to bring something forward into the world. I would say that the leap does us, and we can participate and become more conscious with these structural leaps and work them out in ourselves. This is the individual aspect rather than just the sociological group collective aspect. To the degree that we can work out those mutations in ourselves, to the degree that we as individuals can kind of do that work. Artists attempting to create depth perspective and creating these manuals and doing these paintings and sculptures and exploring realism in landscape at a time where that hadn't existed before really took a lot of interior work. So anyway, that's sort of like the more of a like kind of a what does it look like to talk about all these theories and then kind of wrestle with them in yourself. And I talked about that in my class on Neura about Gebser. And okay, what do? We learned about the structures. We learned about evolution of consciousness. How does this apply to individuals? And he has a very undervalued checklist. It's not really a checklist, but it's kind of a poetic list of ways in which to live as an integral being. And it's a kind of what he just describes a return to primordial trust with life, right? To kind of jump into the big unknown. And not to project so much, very Jungian kind of perspective, not to project so much of ourselves into other people, and to kind of remember, the quote, he who shouts in the forest will hear his own echo. So it's this idea that what we bring to our commons and society is what we are. So we must try to come as integral beings as we can, as whole as we can. And a lot of that is kind of is a kind of tearing down to some degree of the things that are failing us, the mentalities that are failing us personally, and a kind of raising up and deep work with more spiritual qualities, of integrity, wholeness, not projecting your issues on other people, and we all wrestle. These are very human things, It's a very kind of universal way of thinking. Joseph mentioning, hoping John David Ebert will interview Gebser on his Interviewing Dead Philosophers series. Oh my gosh, thanks for bringing that up. I wonder if Ebert's here. So yeah, John David Ebert, one of my big influences and inspirations. He's also in turn very inspired by William Irwin Thompson, and he's read Gebser. I think to many degrees he is an integral thinker in himself. I don't know if you'd call himself that. But he writes beautifully about art and metaphysics and postmodernity and kind of moving through meaning and media studies and everything. So I would definitely recommend his books. But yeah, he's been doing a really fun series for those of you who are kind of interested in this, in that he's working with a medium, and he's doing these fun interviews where the medium is interviewing a dead philosopher. And so, yeah, so that's a kind of interesting premise. I think he's doing Rudolf Steiner next. He's done Joseph Campbell, Oswald Spengler, and a few others. So it's interesting. And I don't know what anybody thinks of mediumship and those kinds of interesting occult dimensions of consciousness culture. But, you know, I've always found those things interesting. The possibility, and this is sort of talked about in psychedelic studies too. I think there was recently a conference at Tyringham about meeting the other in sort of altered states. And what is the other? Does the other have an agency that's outside of us, or is the other, you know, some kind of fragment of our being, you know, or something that transcends that binary that we can't even perceive. So I've just always been kind of interested in these sort of anomalous states of consciousness. And, you know, I think just to kind of, if your skeptical hat is coming on, I would probably recommend Jack Hunter's para-anthropology or paranthropology. And I know he's just written a book about this as well, sort of like an anomalous anthropology. I can't remember the name of it. I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. I don't know if I have the other book here. Probably not. It's not Jack Hunter's. But yeah, there's an interesting anthology volume from Anthropology. This is academics talking about this on the anthology of spirits and what are spirits. And if you're a historical materialist, as most of academia is today, then what do you make of these sort of states of consciousness that are proclaimed to be the other? And how do you interact with a society and a culture as an anthropologist without imposing materialism on them and respecting the fact that they believe, you know, there's some kind of contact going on? Joseph saying, well, Ebert told me that William Aaron Thompson doesn't believe we can contact the dead, but he does believe in an afterlife. William Aaron Thompson mentions frequently, especially in his later writings, he's a mystic, and on top of being a really interesting historian, but he's in communion with, his subjective experience when he's claiming is that he works with different spirits for different, he has a kind of, I think he takes a kind of Indian cosmology with the different spiritual bodies, or, Steiner talks about this as well, the etheric body and the astral body. And he writes about how, each layer, sheath of folding dimensions into the spiritual worlds has a counterpart, a kind of spiritual guide, being, entity, so on. And he works with them, and they're part of his spiritual practice, and they're part of, his life, and in terms of, guiding him and working him through things and helping him with his writing and so on. And, one could argue, if you take this kind of occult, esoteric view of reality, that we all have these things. And I think, I would say I'm leaning on agnosticism, but only because I haven't really developed any contemplative practices to interact with these beings in a direct way so much. But I'm an agnostic leaning on believer that there is an other, and we interact with many others, and there perhaps is an ecology of consciousness in different dimensionalities. In terms of being an artist, I think this very much comes through. And, being a writer myself, and the kinds of states of mind that you write through sometimes almost feel like not you, but more of you're participating in a kind of communion with some other being and bringing something forth. And I think, all kinds of writing actually could do that, or perhaps does that. I think whether or not we're conscious of working with different entities and beings, that's another story. But, clearly it's worked very well for Thompson. I think some of his writing is, some of his books are my favorite books ever written. So yeah, I would recommend them highly as well. And, Thompson's interesting too, because he's Irish. He brings up the kind of bardic tradition of the Irish, and the idea that the bard and the artist is sort of invoking the muses and invoking this kind of larger ecology to sing through me, right? Sing through me, muse, sing in me, muse. So it's this idea of this larger consciousness in which the individual is sort of a conduit for and can participate with. And I essentially agree with that. I think that's absolutely, the reality, and a reality we don't understand, but which we can work with through these different practices. And, Jung worked with that with the Red Book. They kind of burst into his life. He writes about how he kind of had a sort of Saturn return kind of thing where he kind of withered away from those things. And they all kind of blew back right into his life in a kind of arresting, powerful way that could have sort of destroyed his mind if he didn't work with these agencies through imaginative exercises, through the Red Book, through this kind of visionary state. Richard Doyle is calling it, and he's borrowing it from, I think, John C. Lilly and Philip K. Dick. Speaking, as soon as I said that, I got a little pop-up on Facebook about PKD group. That's funny. But it's this idea of metacognition, and I think I mentioned that earlier. But interestingly, Thompson uses that as well in a more recent lecture on YouTube you can find at the Ross School, where he's talking about metacognition being this sort of imaginative, playful space where all the different things that you're learning separately kind of come together, like when you write a poem and it all comes out at once, or when you're dreaming and the dream image is a kind of amalgamation of different aspects of your day and your life, the past, the present, and the future. It's just kind of all wrapped up in this sort of creative, imaginative state. And to go into these states through meditation, through psychedelics, through any kind of altered state where you're consciously working with these things can be very helpful. And again, that's sort of the whole point of this, right? Is to kind of enter into these metacognitive states of participation where you are tuning into what's possible in the present, what's coming forth. What are those signs from the future? I think that's how you can participate. And I think that's how the counterculture really, or the consciousness culture, really took off in, the past 10 years or so, in terms of sort of, needing to imagine futures and utopias and wrestling with the present. And to the degree that we continue to do that will be to the degree that the consciousness culture is still relevant and not just sort of ossifying into its own kind of, aesthetic playing with itself, which to some degree I think is happening, just having kind of been involved in it for as long as I have, which not that long, maybe 10, 15 years. But yeah. So yeah, and that kind of brings you back full circle to the dispossessed and imagination and art as sort of being this sort of metacognitive state where you process history, politics, consciousness evolution, psycho-spiritual struggles of the individual and the culture that they're in. And when you really put your finger on that pulse, you get a kind of a freeze frame of everything that's going on right now, and what is happening latently in the culture. So that's why I brought up the dispossessed, and that's why I brought up science fiction, because I think, and I think I mentioned this in the last mutation session, science fiction is so good because even the pulp science fiction, because Philip K. Dick was a pulp sci-fi writer, right? The pulp science fiction, the high science fiction, whatever you want to call it, it has so much permission to play with everything today, to bring in the occult through technology, to kind of sublimate it through materialism and excuse it. So it kind of brings all of the different cosmologies back in, all of the weird esoteric stuff, all of the everything, and it lets you just play with all of it through the permission of the guise of the present. So science fiction to me is continuously a way to really, the reason why we're interested in Philip K. Dick these days, and Margaret Atwood and so on, and these have moved from a kind of sideshow geekdom, or perceived as such, to something that is speaking to the heart of what we're struggling with as a civilization, as a culture today, is because that they're able to do this. They're able to kind of imaginatively play in these metacognitive states, whether or not they're conscious of it. Thompson also says we tell more than we know. So I think there's something of that going on as well. So, but anyway, I have just been rambling. Let's go for a few more minutes, and then we'll close up, so I don't bore you all on this nice afternoon on Saturday. So yeah, if anybody has any thoughts, happy to hear them, happy to riff on them. And also, I was mentioning, as we're waiting for any comments to pop in here, guests. I have a little set list of potential guests. I guess I could name them, but it's kind of funny because I know some of you guys and you might be watching it and you're just kind of being drafted publicly. So maybe I shouldn't mention them. But I have some friends, I have some good friends here. Some of them are my patrons, and I would love to have you on. I'm on Zoom. I'm live streaming through Zoom. So there could be more than one person speaking here. We could have conversations. I was immediately thinking of Connor Habib, but I know Jen Zart as well, my good friend and colleague from Revelor. And, that would be great for us to kind of riff on stuff as well. And maybe if Thompson is up for it, we can do a little talk together, and a few others as well. But I won't name everybody offhand. But I just think it would be fun to kind of bring people into the mix and start just having conversations about the present, with all of the premise of what I'm talking about in mind, and just sort of engaging. Oh, Karthik, interesting question. Do threshold guardian archetypes present themselves in LeGuin, PKD, etc.? It's a very archetypal question. I'm trying to think offhand. Maybe not so much in the Highness cycle with LeGuin, that sort of threshold guardian. I haven't read Earthsea, so there could be something more to that with the dragons and wizards of Earthsea, right? So I'd probably look there more consciously, but this is just a superficial reflection. But it's a little bit more complicated, I think, in Le Guin's writings in general, and that she's really playing with very profound depth of characters who come to life, but don't necessarily follow a strict hero's journey. As a whole, I think like The Left Hand of Darkness is certainly a hero's journey. It's about this lone anthropologist coming to this world called Winter, where gender and sexuality has become very different, and all humans on this planet, for the most part, are androgynous and can shift. And I'm drawing a blank with like some basic biology stuff, but their sexuality is more like a cat. They don't have a menstrual cycle. It's the other one, the one like dogs and cats have, where there's a period where they go into heat, and then they kind of morph depending on psychosocial bodily interactions with each other. One becomes biological male or female, and then they have sex, and there's kind of this sort of overtaking of this sort of moment where they all kind of do that. Anyway, so there's a whole culture is built on a very different sense of self and identity and gender, and the planet's called Winter, so it's like an ice age planet. So they've really become, by living in such a space, very different than us. And so here's a human from Earth who's coming to this planet as an anthropologist on a hero's journey, in a way, to kind of come to understand and connect and make, again, a very kind of big picture narrative, but to make contact and to bring winter into this larger decentralized web, this anarchic web of civilizations strewn across the stars, and inviting them into the ecumen. And a lot of it's interesting exploration of that. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like slaying the dragon and threshold guardians and those kinds of things, but and Philip K. Dick either. I mean, he's very trickstery, right? It really depends. What might be a threshold guardian might also be another thing. So maybe to some degree. So I'm sorry I don't have as concrete answer to that, but yeah, I would definitely look more towards the Earthsea trilogy for that. Samantha, thank you. Estrus, yes, that's what I was looking for, that word. So Joseph is mentioning, I'd be very surprised if Peterson were aware of Gebser or William or Thompson. I assume he's aware of Deleuze, but probably throws him under the useless pomo like Sir Roger Scruton does, but he never mentions Deleuze by name. Yeah, probably not. Probably not. I don't know what Peterson would make of Deleuze. Many people don't know what to make of Deleuze and Guattari. But that's the thing, you read, you move away from these kind of like statements that are lambasting postmodern thought, and you actually read the inner conversations in postmodern thought, and they're much more nuanced and complicated, and they have very different answers. And I think Deleuze was kind of answering Marx, and with his what was that combination of Freud and Marx that he was working with there, and critique of Lacan. So like there's so much complexity in these thinkers that to just say that they're all cultural Marxists is rather silly. Especially the spirituality in Deleuze and the kind of implicated esotericism, as Joshua Ramey talks about in the Hermetic Deleuze. I mean, gosh, this can open up a world to you. Speaking of meaning, right, and depth, this kind of revives. Deleuze and Guattari were reviving Bergson, right? They were reviving this idea of the élan vital and the connective meaning of desire as the desiring machines, and the desire makes up this kind of organism with the object that it desires, and that both are needed for anything to happen. They're like kind of complementary. These beautiful poetic depth of meaning that they're exploring, as well as a critique of capitalism and everything else. But they weren't. I mean, it's just silly. Dave Zuckerman saying another good example is the Bobbyverse stories by Dennis Taylor. Thank you. Thanks for hopping on, Dave. Good to see you here. I'm going to write that down, Bobbyverse stories. And what I love about this too is like we're all getting this stuff, like I'm mentioning a bunch of people and you're mentioning different authors to check out. And I think this is how you build that kind of that culture, right? You have these sort of transparent dialogues where we're all swapping books and essays. No, I don't know the Bobbyverse. I'm really excited to learn more about them. I'm going to definitely Google them after this. But yeah, I mean, I think referencing the sort of interesting anthropological writings of LeGuin. So yeah, where do we go from here? Do we wrap up, or do we want to riff on this a little more? Let's see if I have any questions in. And yeah, Neil, if you'd like to mention anything too, there is a Q&A box. There's a chat box. Happy to hear from you as well. I see you're in the the Zoom software. So let's see if there's anything else happening here. Another thing about, okay, well, I should probably mention this because I wanted to mention this about PKD. Max is asking how top suggestions on books from PKD and LeGuin. I was just mentioning this. I don't know if you heard at the beginning, but The Dispossessed is a great book. And The Left Hand of Darkness is another great book by LeGuin. Either of those I would start with. The Left Hand of Darkness as an aesthetically, I find to be more immersive. And it's not an actiony plot, and neither of them are really full of action, but there is a kind of culminative journey that the characters have to go through. But just in general, in terms of the beauty of the planet Winter, the interesting play of anthropology, the questions of big history, and because the anthropologist protagonist is coming into this world of Winter, initiating them into this, again, the ecumene, this sort of networked anarchic space age civilization of many, many distant stars that all communicate through the Ansible, but are kind of in a time relativity with each other. Again, very beautiful kind of Taoist futurist cosmology there. But, I think the questions are very integral and philosophical and big history oriented, in that they're wrestling with, the political movements on the planet of Winter are moving towards modernity and progress in their own kind of different way, and with their own different set of questions about how to move into this sort of modernist centrality, or if that's even good for them, and the evolution of consciousness and culture as a sort of non-linear complex thing. It really speaks to that. So I would say Left Hand of Darkness, and then The Dispossessed, because The Dispossessed kind of takes that up another notch, even though I think this was written first, I'm not sure. In 1974, I don't know when Left Hand was written, but The Dispossessed talks about, again, these two societies, these two twin planets. One is a breakaway anarchist nation, a utopian experiment, and the other is more like Earth. And the fascinating conversations about utopia and history and freedom and breaking down walls and anarchism. And again, this whole idea from Zizek is the signs from the future, this experiment. And then again, my interpretation of The Dispossessed is actually that Zizek, the protagonist, has this breakthrough into integral consciousness through his revolution in science and his political philosophy. And it's a kind of revolution that wants to render transparent all walls, all limits, all boundaries between people and beings, and this kind of interbeing of suffering and compassion in the universe. But it's not that simple, because he wrestles with, people don't want that, right? Not everybody wants that. There's all these issues and difficulties in reaching that utopia, even within the utopian state itself. So if you're interested in that more, if you're interested in bringing utopias to life and seeing what happens, then, I think The Dispossessed is really interesting in all of those respects. So yeah, I would recommend that. PKD. Okay, so PKD is harder for me because it depends on what you like. In terms of recommendations, we've just read with the PKD class, and I'm going to link it here in the chat box for you, on neurolearning. We are doing a 6 or 7 week class with Richard Doyle from Penn State, and we're basically reading through a PKD book a week, which has been a lot because I'm also trying to work on Southern Reach for the upcoming Southern Reach class on neuro. And we've just read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And now we're reading The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. I just posted it in the chat, in the Facebook chat. And both of those books are really interesting, but, reading, gosh, sorry, I'm just posting this here. Reading Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep again, like 10 years after I've read it for the first time, really, having read about the Anthropocene and empathy, now there's empathy machines and all these things, it's a fascinating prescience about today. Here's a world that's been ecologically destroyed, and in which the loss of animals, the presence of ecocide on this planet has created a kind of fetishization of living animals because they are so rare. They've become this kind of holy entities. And there's become this kind of value in sort of going into the state through these like weird machines that look a little bit like Scientology's e-meters. you go into this VR state. It's a kind of religious experience in VR. You hold these handles and it's like an empathy machine, and you go through this kind of visionary state of this future religion of Mercerism, where you experience the suffering of Mercer and the suffering of the world and the problem of entropy and things dying. And there's this kind of, there's a mournfulness in it, but there's also a kind of, it anticipates climate change in the Anthropocene and the emphasis of empathy as this kind of cosmic compassion in a way that is so powerful. It's like a fine wine that the book is aging in a kind of eerie way more and more beautifully with time going on. So I would say Do Androids Dream. Ubik is another great book with Philip K. Dick in terms of where to start. It emphasizes the reality destroying ability of Dick's literary writing style, where he can build up a world and then unwrite it. And the way he makes you, again, speaking of empathy, the style of writing participates you in the character's narrative and identity. So when that identity breaks down, when that world breaks down, when you close the book, you kind of, Eric Davis talks about this too, it kind of makes reality feel a little weird for a few hours afterwards or a few days. You might have a few synchronicities start to happen around you. I know I was reading Ubik, which has to do, interestingly, with time. And part of the story is that how time seems to be regressing and decaying. So that, your modern laptop is fine, right? And then you walk away from it and you come back to it, and then it's like a 2001 laptop that no longer works very well, will barely connect to the internet. Then you come back and it's a typewriter. So there's this kind of strange devolution of time going on. And I was reading this book here in Florida in St. Petersburg as we were first moving here and exploring the city. And St. Petersburg is kind of interesting in that it's got really kind of modern, hipster new spaces with coffee houses and new buildings. And then you turn a corner and you end up in this sort of rundown mid-century 1950s, 1960s sort of like motel aesthetic. And it's just sort of this time slippage where time seems to be like oscillating and falling into the past constantly. And I think you see that a lot in the South in general. But again, it creates these kind of, reality distorting experiences. I always say Philip K. Dick is kind of a literary psychoactive. And then to put it back to LeGuin, I would say she wrote a book, sort of an homage to Philip K. Dick, who she very much valued and enjoyed and appreciated as one of the literary greats of the 20th century. She wrote The Lath of Heaven, or The Lathe of Heaven, which again has to do with dreams and reality. And I would probably say that's the third LeGuin book I'd recommend. The second PKD book is Ubik. And there's a couple of others. If you're interested in alternative history, Man in the High Castle. If you're interested in more philosophical and cosmological questions without as much of that kind of fast-paced pulp narrative, then I would probably go with Dick's later books, like the Valis trilogy, especially Valis, which is in and of itself a like hyper real postmodern text where he's writing himself. Philip K. Dick is writing himself into the novel as Horse Lover Fat, and then writing himself again as another character, Phil Dick. It's quite an experience to read that. And he's talking about his actual book, The Exegesis, his binders of books. Of papers that he calls the exegesis. So Joseph's mentioning that no store or library carries Dick's exegesis. That's really surprising because it's the most academic of his works. And let me pull it out here, everybody. And Richard Doyle, who's on the Neuro class, he wrote the afterword to this, and he helped edit it. It's a giant. This is a fragment of the actual exegesis. And basically, Philip K. Dick is one of these authors who wasn't just writing about things implicitly, although that is true. He had a weird experience in 1974, and weird is an understatement. He had a religious experience. He had a kind of paranormal experience with this pink beam of light and all these strange things that were happening to him, and sort of channeling or communicating with this entity, a kind of spiritual guide like Sophia. And anyway, he thought this is sort of a parallel or a counterpart to Jung's Red Book, where Jung started to have this sort of psychosis, a kind of breakdown of his mind, where he had to work through what he was experiencing through the creative act of writing the Red Book and drawing and painting, and sort of eruption of the unconscious. A little different for Philip K. Dick, but it's a similar idea of this profound, life-altering religious experience that, as a writer and as an artist, Philip K. Dick tried to make sense of it through creating and writing about it and postulating what it meant. Was it just some brain problem he was having? Was it this thing? Was it Gnosticism? Did the Gnostics have it right? Did these people have it right? And as Eric Davis brings up, it's a postmodern counterpart to the Red Book. It's a kind of as Richard Doyle says, it's a book that has no spine. It's a hacking the hero's journey, to bring this up again. And then that's a postmodern text with no real answer, just a sort of circumnavigation of the answer, which doesn't reveal itself. And in some degree, it's very frustrating because Philip K. Dick was not, some realized mystic. He was a troubled human being who nevertheless had a very profound experience, and in that sense, you can relate to it. But yeah, this is just a fragment. The size of this book is just a fragment of the binders and folders of his writings, just wrestling with this religious encounter. But if you're interested in diving deep into it, I do recommend probably not starting with the exegesis, but probably with Vallis, if you're interested in this part. And Vallis and what he ended up writing there, because it's very autobiographical. It takes selections from the work of the exegesis and his own life, and it's a good starter point before diving into the exegesis. And again, there might be somewhat of a narrative, and then he's going back and forth through time, writing letters and exploring the book, exploring his experience. But it's not necessarily an easy read, so maybe that's why it's not sold that much. I don't know. Yep, Divine Invasions, Samantha. Totally, that's the name of one of his books in the Vallis trilogy, The Divine Invasion. And I always bring up Philip K. Dick. Sorry if I'm going on too long here, folks. I'll wrap it up soon. But I always bring up Philip K. Dick because he is an integral evolutionary thinker, not in the sense that he read Gebser or Aurobindo, but he did read Teilhard. And one of Teilhard's writings, this is my cat, by the way, for those of you who keep hearing her. I know. She's really vocal, as all ragdolls are very vocal. Anyways, Philip K. Dick in the exegesis mentions Teilhard, and he mentions Tagore, but Teilhard specifically about how one of the individuals who could make the most sense of what he experienced, which he thought was the logos. And reading Teilhard, The Phenomenon of Man, after the experience, not before or during, but after the experience, it seemed to confirm a lot of what he was encountering in this sort of download. That being that he felt that there was some kind of cosmic evolution taking place. He described it as the logos invading matter, invading the kind of broken world, facing entropy, and raising it up through some kind of transubstantiation, transforming the irrational into the rational, or into the logos. And it's not a far jump and a skip from his reading of the New Sphere and Teilhard and the Phenomenon of Man and the evolution of consciousness, and sort of this sort of Teilhardian involutionary cosmology, and then jumping over to Sri Aurobindo, who wrote even more explicitly about this and beautifully. And Sri Aurobindo is another writer who, like Rich Doyle and I often say, reading Sri Aurobindo, it has a similar effect on you, in that the writing itself seems to be a kind of literary psychoactive, right? Kind of there's a kind of literary pharmacology at work here with writers and what they're able to kind of exfoliate or open up in your mind. And reading Aurobindo, I think, is kind of a profound experience that in my encounters with him, you have to kind of like take small doses, because it's almost like staying in the light too long. It kind of is almost blinding. And then you kind of digest it and integrate it and come back. So as Aurobindo is another profound author that I've returned to again and again over time. But Dave is mentioning Bob is a tech bro who dies in our time and wakes up immediately afterward to find that his consciousness has been taken and placed into a space probe 200 years in the future. Whoa. All right, I'm definitely going to have to check this out. I think I have heard of that because I've heard of that premise before. That's kind of interesting. David, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that more, just in terms of like, what is that saying? How's that speaking to us today? I can think of a few things, but I'd rather hear it from you before diving into it, because I've never heard anything beyond that premise. Yeah, we could just chat all day. I mean, these topics are so fascinating. Philip K. Dick and the future, and and just sort of my work with my writing will hopefully, and Richard Doyle's too, because we're doing something with Revelor, with Richard Doyle, kind of putting Philip K. Dick into the, if you would say, the literary pantheon, the kind of history of individuals who are associated with Teilhardian thought, sort of evolutionary integral thinkers, Dave's saying the book asks what it means to be human as Bob makes a VR of the 20th/21st century to live in. I wonder if this says anything about us right now, in that we feel, it makes copies of himself. Interesting. And that we feel kind of displaced, right? We've woken up in a future and we just want to be on Earth again. And disembodied through our technologies, right? There's a kind of disembodiment that takes place with the internet and virtual space, in the sense that, we're kind of interacting with each other with these virtual bodies and kind of all debating and arguing with each other like little satellites floating through the astral plane, building our own worlds and sharing those virtual worlds, but perhaps missing that embodiment. William Aaron Thompson talks about this too, as a kind of esoteric interpretation. John David Ebert as well, of the internet age and digital culture as a sort of materialization of the astral plane, as the sort of esoteric dimension of reality, of floating bodies, disembodied states, and parasitic entities that hijack our consciousness like trolls, right? And I think of 4chan, and I immediately am a believer in this interpretation, and the alt-right, and that whole vein of thinking. But there's also good things about this. There's not just little demonic creatures and beings that, and demonic creatures and beings that hijack us. There's also angelic beings and so on in this kind of larger cosmic pantheon that are influencing and motivating us. But the kind of breakdown of the physical world and the eruption of the astral dimension in these kind of immaterial ontologies creates a problem, and we need grounding. We want grounding, and I think that's very often why we are reaching back into different aesthetic decades like vintage stuff and hipsters. I am part of that. I've developed a appreciation for typewriters, and I've returned in a very pragmatic way to handwritten notes. I wasn't raised with iPads or anything. So I think just my brain formatively requires tactile engagement with note-taking and writing to some degree. So anyway, but yeah, so this whole idea of disembodiment in the astral plane and virtualization of reality. And at the other hand, we have a kind of etherealization of materialism, which is sort of just fading and fading away. A lot of people in the tech world talk about the sort of climatological cycle of technology, where it's moving from like solid states into the cloud, and this kind of vaporware and this kind of vaporization of hardware, and etherealization and virtualization of reality as it kind of becomes the stuff of air. A very kind of Aquarian age problem, if you could interpret it that way. So what does that mean? I think if we're going to believe that in the evolution of consciousness, it has to do with the incarnation or the kind of involution of higher ontologies like the astral plane or the psychic being, or Sri Aurobindo's the intermediary realm, then perhaps it's sort of a precursor, again, in the kind of way that evil enunciates the next world order, or at first is problematic, that, you know, these kinds of things get unleashed, they cause havoc, they cause chaos, and they don't have answers. But I think the next step is really what the Teilhardian idea of building the earth, right? And sort of taking these fragments of utopia, taking these fragments of the future and building bodies with them. And learning to work and navigate these you know, immaterial realms in a wise way, rather than just sort of blowing open the hatches and allowing everything to run wild. I think they have their own logic, and we'll have to figure that out. And in some ways, we're kind of returning to the sea in this kind of immaterialization and disembodiment. We're kind of becoming floating bodies, right? So I think it's going to be a learning curve, and to some degree, there needs to be more integration and grounding. And I don't know how we're going to do that. I don't have an answer. I just think this is where we're at. This is where I sense consciousness is struggling at the moment, with the disembodiment of reality, the hyper real, the sort of postmodern Philip K. Dickian sense that, you know, worlds are constructed and they seem to be kind of falling apart just as we're making them, and our identities are doing the same thing. The sense of self is sort of this slipstream kind of thing. Again, there's an overwhelming quality to it now, but I think the only answer is a kind of a Gnostic, mystic response to kind of get through the dissolution of world and self, and instill or situate something more balanced and whole, that is okay with all those things breaking down and breaking away. And is, you know, there's never going to not be an incarnational element if we're talking about esotericism. I think that's sort of the intent, to kind of bring things into the world. So integration is really important. And I think in the coming centuries, integration is going to be the big thing, the integral age, as it were, but it's kind of a kind of grounding evolutionary idea rather than kind of a flighty transcending into ethereal realms. They're both kind of happening. And somewhere in the middle is the hard work of kind of bringing them together and building the future body and the future body politic, right? The planetized human being is sort of the human civilization in union with the biosphere and the rest of the spiritual worlds, right? So who knows what that looks like? We're just in the middle of it. We're just little people trying to figure it out. But anyway, I've gone for like an hour and a half, 90 minutes. So I think we're good. Hi, Ed. Coming in the last minute. But yeah, if anybody has any last minute riffs or thoughts about all this stuff, I mean, this is really interesting. Thanks so much for coming in and sharing your ideas and your thoughts and your recommendations. We've been passing around some good readings here and good books. I'm going to link to my Patreon because that's what this is all about. Building a consciousness culture and a consciousness culture community that is, privileging the sharing of letters, you know, the kind of invisible college style exchange of ideas, of conversations, of recommendations for reading, of essays and books, and publishing each other and citing each other, and, you know, at an academic level and on a social level, and thinking about the present. and thinking about what's going on with consciousness in the present through that whole process. That's sort of our mandate as integral evolutionary consciousness culture people. It's not to kind of go into our own cloister. It's to come together, reflect, and engage very deeply with the present and with what's being told by everybody everywhere, no matter what community they're in. Everything is a kind of, for the physician who's seeing the whole body of the earth and the body politic of culture, it's the whole being that's expressing where it's at and where it's going, where it wants to go. So we have to look at it all, right? And that's the hard part about this sort of thing. It's transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. It requires a lot of kind of kneading of the dough and kind of rolling it over again and again and again in the present. But I think that's sort of what a lot of us are doing and should continue to do. And if you're interested in supporting the Patreon, that would be awesome. What I would like to do is build this out a little bit more towards conversations with other thinkers and writers and scholars and have them on these live streams. Basically, as I was mentioning at the beginning, to turn this into a podcast, to supplement the book writing and editing and publishing and kind of contributing to, all of us are contributing to the consciousness culture, however we define that. And, if you want to support me through doing that, that would be awesome. As I mentioned, what I'm doing is I'm writing books and I'm doing editing and publishing and writing. So I think the most powerful way to build a culture and a community is to publish, whether it's these videos or through creating literature and building the aesthetic literary community where everybody's reading and writing each other and influencing each other and expanding their ideas and engaging with the larger culture. That's where I feel is the most impact we can do. And hopefully, continuing the conversation and not getting stuck in our own little cloisters, in our own little, patting ourselves on the back. We don't want to do that, but we do want to have a space for each other. So that's what this is. If you're interested in the topics we talked about today, that's awesome. And you can support me on Patreon. I think it's starting at $1 a month to $5 to $10. I think the highest one I added is $50. That's the cosmic patron, and under that is the cosmic beneficiary, which is $20, and so on and so on. But everybody gets access to this. Patrons get access to the Zoom live stream. So you're seeing the live stream anyway, but they get to be directly on the webinar if they want to participate and hop on and stream with me. And yeah, so if you like this, you want to make this more of this happen, more time for this to happen, for writing and publishing and editing and building the community and building the culture and the conversations, feel free to support me there. I have my Patreon link in the chat box. So next time, it'll probably be me, but if I can get somebody else to come on with me, that'd be great. If you have a recommendation or would like to be on, please let me know. Or if you have a recommendation for somebody you'd love to see here, that's also what this is all about. So thanks again, guys. And I will see you probably, this is monthly, but there might be a little bit more time at the end of the month. So we might do this at the end of February too. So thanks so much for tuning in and for your support and for your conversation. It's much, much appreciated. All right, everybody oh, wait a second. I have one more question from Neil. Thank you, Neil. Okay, if nobody minds. Shouldn't the whole planet be a protected biosphere versus what is happening right now, a destruction of nature, which is causing the disharmony with nature, the crisis in consciousness we are seeing? Yes. And I think to sum it up is the idea that, so Thompson talks about this a lot, and a lot of the Lindisfarne folks talk about this a lot, is to see and I mentioned this at the beginning of this talk, is to see the biosphere and the geosphere and the noosphere as folded into each other, not even just as strata, but in a kind of Deleuzean sense of the becoming other, and the flows of energy and minerals and power and solar power and all these things that kind of power a civilization flowing through each other, the flows of mediums, the flows of a written communication system versus electronic, or both simultaneously, kind of getting the whole gestalt in this sort of metacognitive state, the whole being. And then that's the integral enterprise, right? It's the idea of wholeness and holding the whole in your mind's eye and your being and your body. That's the integral orientation. And it requires a kind of visionary state, I believe, in the sense of imagination. So thank you, Neil, for your last question. And hope to see you again next session. And thank you, everybody. See you in a couple weeks. Have a good February. Stay safe, stay warm. And yeah, for those of you, see you this week on Neura for the Tanu class on esotericism and sound and mysticism, and the Richard Doyle class on Monday about Philip K. Dick, which is session 3. The link is in the chat here. Good night, or good day, everybody, and see you in a couple weeks. Take care.